The AP voters have Gonzaga just outside the top 5, while KenPom barely has the Zags in the top 10. Is Mark Few's team actually getting undervalued heading into the season?
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Welcome into the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Today's episode of Locked On Zags is brought to you by FanDuel. Folks, place your first $5 bet, and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Just visit FanDuel.com to get started. Well, on Sunday, both the AP, on Monday morning, the AP Top 25 was revealed. On Sunday, late in the evening, just before the poll came out, KenPom released their rankings for all of the Division I college basketball teams, which means we got a bunch of rankings to pour through on today's show. We're talking about the AP poll, Gonzaga's opponents, who else is ranked, what it means for their non-conference schedule. We're also going to talk about the KenPom rankings. We're going to talk about how Gonzaga's ranked, how the rest of Gonzaga's non-conference and WCC schedule, where those teams show up in the polls. And then we're going to close out the show talking about the future Pac-12, knowing that this upcoming season is not a Pac-12 season, but it's a good comparison for how the teams that Gonzaga will be in the conference with in a couple of years are looking coming into this season. We start with the AP poll revealed again Monday morning, 9 a.m. West Coast time. The Zags just outside the top 5. They come in at number 6 overall in the poll behind Kansas, who is number 1, Alabama at 2, the back-to-back defending national champion UConn Huskies at number 3. 2 more Big 12 teams round out the top 5, Houston at number 4 and Iowa State at number 5. That means 3 Big 12 teams in the top 5, and actually I think 5 of them in the top 10. Tremendous showing for the Big 12. If they'd been able to actually add Gonzaga and UConn, they would have had 7 of the top 10 teams, at least in the conference or in the future conference for the Big 12 at that point. Gonzaga did receive 1 first place vote, coming in at 6th overall. The rest of the top 10, Duke is at 7, Baylor is at 8, North Carolina is at 9, and then Arizona, again, giving you 5 Big 12 teams. They come in at number 10. Per Theo Lawson of the Spokesman Review, Gonzaga is now one of 5 teams that has appeared in each of the last 15 preseason top 25 polls. So every season in the last 15 years, when the poll comes out before the season begins, Gonzaga is in the top 25. The only other schools that is a reality. So you'd think it is the bluest of the blue bloods: Duke, North Carolina, Kansas, Kentucky, and Gonzaga, the 5 schools that have been in the AP preseason top 25 in each of the last 15 years. And 6 feels about right. I think there's an argument that could be in the top 5. I think there's an argument as high as 3. This is a season where you have a combination of teams that retain a lot of key talent, which is why they're highly regarded. Gonzaga's in that group, along with Iowa State, who returns the majority of their key contributors from last year. Alabama's in that conversation as well, returning Grant Nelson and, of course, Mark Sears, and adding some key pieces as well. You also have teams that have a bunch of newcomers that are in the top 5, top 10. Kansas being among them. They returned 3 of their key pieces, and Hunter Dickinson and DeJuan Harris and KJ Adams, but they also get AJ Storr in the mix. They also get a handful of other players coming in as well. Zeke Mayo from South Dakota State's a big-time addition for them. Ryland Griffin comes in as well from Alabama. So there's some teams that kind of have a mix of both in that conversation. Duke obviously has their star-studded 5-man freshman class. Baylor's got 2 really key transfers in Jeremy Roach and Norchad Omier in the front court, as well as VJ Edgecombe, their star freshman, coming in as well. So you're kind of seeing a combination of, this is a team that has a bunch of new players, so we're going to rank them highly. This is a team that has a bunch of roster continuity, so we're going to rank them highly. Or this is a team that's coached by Danny Hurley, so we're going to rank them highly, even though it's a team that lost 4 of their 5 starters from last year. It's a team that does actually have a fair amount of continuity in the sense that Samson Johnson's back, Hassan Diarra's back, Solomon Ball is back, Jalen Stewart's back, all guys who are going to step into bigger roles. They make some nice additions as well. Aiden Mahaney, of course, from St. Mary's, Liam McNeely, their star freshman, coming in. I wouldn't have had UConn in the top 5. I haven't done my top 25 rankings yet. UConn's going to be a lot closer to 10 than they are to 1. To be perfectly honest, I'm not super sold on this roster at this point, and I think I'm going to probably have them in the 8 to 10 range in my rankings. Hard to bet against Danny Hurley, obviously, but 3 felt like a pretty aggressive spot for a team replacing 4 of their 5 starters, even in this era where you're seeing rosters turn over as much as they are. That's a lot of turnover for a team to be ranked this highly coming into the season. But overall, for Gonzaga, 6 feels about right. They're next to Iowa State, a team that is very similar in a lot of ways, returns pretty much their entire core from last year's team. They add a really key piece in Joshua Jefferson, of course, also from St. Mary's, joining the Cyclones team. I think Gonzaga's overall additions are better. I think the combination of Michael Ajayi and Caleb Battle is a better group of additions than Joshua Jefferson and Brandon Chatfield and others for this Iowa State team. But Iowa State was a better team last year than Gonzaga. So I think ultimately Iowa State having a bunch of continuity and some good additions keeps them a little higher than Gonzaga, who wasn't quite as good last year, has some better additions, but also lost a key piece in Anton Watson. St. Mary's received 5 votes to be in the top 25. That places them 45th among all the teams. As we get further into the season, the amount of teams getting votes is going to dwindle down significantly. Oftentimes there's barely more than like 33, 34 total teams who receive a vote, but in the preseason, it's a bit of a wild card. So for St. Mary's to get 5 votes and that being 45th is an indication of how many different teams were in that AP, were voted on at least once by AP voters. St. Mary's tied with Wisconsin for that spot. And the Zags are going to play at least 4 ranked teams this season, 4 preseason ranked teams, likely as many as 6, depending on what happens, of course, in the battle for Atlantis. Baylor, Gonzaga's season opener on November 4th at the Spokane Arena. Baylor is 8th. So as many people have projected, that is a matchup between 2 top 10 teams. We also know, or at least have heard, I do not believe it is finalized, but it has been indicated, I think Jeff Goodman is the first to report this, that the Gonzaga-Baylor game will be on ESPN2 and will take place at the conclusion of the Monday Night Football game. That means it's looking at about an 8:30 p.m. tip on the West Coast. So you're going to want to have plenty of coffee, especially if you're an East Coast person listening to the show, and that game's not going to tip till 11:30 p.m. That's rough. We kind of thought that was going to be the case. Isaac and I have talked about this on the Locked On College Basketball podcast. College basketball should not be starting their season on Monday night, competing against Monday Night Football. It just does not make sense. This year, they should have started it on Wednesday the 6th because of the election on Tuesday. Most other seasons, they should start on Tuesday. I'm a firm believer in that, and I think the fact that this Gonzaga-Baylor game is going to be not watched by very many people on the East Coast is a clear indication of why that needs to change going forward. Neither Arizona State or San Diego State are ranked, although they both did receive 2 votes from the AP voters. Arizona State's who Gonzaga will play on the 10th of November. San Diego State, they play on the 18th down in San Diego. And then you get to the Atlantis, West Virginia, not ranked, but Gonzaga's second opponent, either Indiana or Louisville. Indiana's ranked 17th in the preseason poll. Louisville received 4 votes. And then Arizona, of course, the potential championship matchup for Gonzaga. They start the season ranked 10th. After that, Gonzaga's got 3 Saturdays in the month of December where they're playing a ranked team. First, Kentucky, December 7th, Climate Pledge Arena. Mark Pope's new look roster comes in 23rd overall in the polls. UConn, of course, 3rd, as we talked about already. That game on the 14th of December at the Madison Square Garden, one of the best college basketball games of the season. And then UCLA, December 28th at the Intuit Dome. Mick Cronin's team, 22nd in the preseason poll. So Gonzaga's playing at least 4 ranked teams: Baylor, Kentucky, UConn, UCLA, probably 6 if they play Indiana and Arizona in that series. It's possible if they end up playing Louisville that Louisville's ranked by the time that game rolls around. So I think there's a good chance they play 6, almost certainly at least playing 5 preseason ranked teams. We'll see if anything changes. I don't think San Diego State will be ranked by November 18th necessarily, but I wouldn't be surprised if they end up ranked at some point or multiple points during the season. Let's move away from the AP poll for right now and instead talk about KenPom. Historically, KenPom's data has had Gonzaga ranked higher than how the actual human voters project them in the AP poll, but this year that is not the case. KenPom barely has Gonzaga in the top 10 with an alarmingly bad adjusted defensive efficiency rating. We're going to talk about that in just a second. right after we talk about our Roy Player of the Week. And this week we had FanFest on Saturday, some fun performances there. So we're going to show some love to Inez Betancourt, who had 10 points to lead all scorers in Gonzaga women's basketball's FanFest event. We're putting $10 on Betancourt right now through Roy, the ultimate platform where you get to directly support your favorite athletes. Download Roy on iOS or Google Play Store. No middleman, no collective making the decisions for you. You get to decide who gets the backing, and it's as easy as just a few clicks. And here's the best part. With Roy, you know exactly where your money's going. Roy gives you the power to decide who gets your support. Time to put your money where your mouth is. Every contribution from fans like us helps keep athletes committed to the team. And if they decide to transfer, you get your money back. How's that for transparency? What are you waiting for? Download the Roy app today and make your contribution. Not only are you supporting the athlete's journey, but you're also helping to keep your team strong for next season. Remember, if they stay, you win. And if they leave, no worries. You get your cash back. That wraps up our Roy Player of the Week segment. Don't forget, if you want to support more athletes and be a part of their success stories, Roy is the way to go. Keep those contributions coming, and let's change the NIL game. All right, folks, segment 2, and it is Ken Pomeroy time. We are discussing KenPom's preseason projections. The AP poll came out with their top 25, but KenPom, couple hours before that, he comes out with his top 361, every team in college basketball ranked using his data. We've talked a lot about KenPom on the show. Obviously, it's a very valuable resource. He's also a former guest of the show, which always helps to be able to promote that. But we're going to talk about where Gonzaga showed up in these rankings, talk about their non-conference schedule as well, and of course the WCC slate and the new Pac-12. So Gonzaga came in at number 9 in KenPom's preseason projections. That's fairly low. I feel like Gonzaga's typically in the top 5 or the top, at least the top 6, 7, 8 range. 9 feels lower than they typically are. It's rare to see them below where they end up in the AP poll, at least in the preseason conversation. But we're not surprised to see that Gonzaga is second in the country in adjusted offensive efficiency. That is a place that Gonzaga very frequently lives in the top 5 among the best and most efficient offenses in the entire country. The only team with a higher adjusted offensive efficiency in the preseason is the Alabama Crimson Tide. Not a surprise there. They are an excellent offensive team and should continue to be so with Mark Sears back, with Grant Nelson back. They add Cliff Omoruyi. They add some other star players into that team as well. Houston Millett among them from Pepperdine. That's going to be a really good team. But Gonzaga is the second highest regarded offensive team in the country per KenPom's adjusted offensive efficiency. The reason they're 9th is that their adjusted defensive efficiency is 45th. Folks, that's not good at all. In fact, among the top 25 ranked teams at KenPom, Gonzaga's 45th adjusted defensive efficiency is the worst among all of the top 25. That is alarmingly bad for this Gonzaga team. I believe the next team that has a defensive efficiency below Gonzaga is Mississippi State. They come in at Iowa. They come in at 33rd in the poll. So all the top 32 teams are more highly regarded defensively than Gonzaga, according to KenPom's preseason projections. Also, we spoke about the Zags tempo on Monday's edition of the show. For those of you who listened to that, KenPom has Gonzaga's tempo projected at 48th. Now, the tempo projections preseason are a little tough to do because it's so dependent on whether the coach makes any changes or not. So while I think the adjusted offensive and defensive efficiencies are obviously not foolproof before the season, and Ken would tell you that himself, tempo to me feels even more difficult to project until you've actually seen some legitimate gameplay. I would not be surprised at all if Gonzaga finishes higher in adjusted defensive efficiency and in tempo than they are currently projected. Having said that, it is acceptable and reasonable. That's a better word to use. It is reasonable to have concern about Gonzaga's defense coming into the season. 45th would be a bad result. I've said this on the show. No team in the KenPom era, which goes back to 1997, no team has won a national championship with an end of season adjusted defensive efficiency worse than 22. So Gonzaga's is much worse than that. Again, you go into the tournament at 28 and you just put the clamps on people for 6 games, you're probably going to end up in the top 20 at the end of the season. So there's a little bit of kind of confirmation bias of sorts in that regard. But I still think for Gonzaga, that's an area that they need to be better. Losing Anton Watson really hurts. You replace him with Michael Ajayi, who's a very good player, but not nearly the level of defender that Michael Ajayi is. Caleb Battle, not a great defensive player either. Part of the equation, though, is what those players look like in Gonzaga's defensive system. Is it possible or even likely that those players improve defensively being coached by Mark Few and this staff and on this system, as opposed to, where Ajayi was before at Pepperdine with Coach Romar, and of course, Caleb Battle, who's now on his fourth school, has played for Eric Musselman last year at Arkansas. I think it's very plausible that both those players are going to be better defensive players than systems like KenPom or Evan Miyakawa or Torvik or others are giving them credit for. But how much does that move the needle in terms of Gonzaga's overall defensive projection? Because we have a pretty good sense of the majority of players on Gonzaga's roster and what they're going to look like in this system. Ryan Nembhard, Nolan Hickman, Ben Gregg, Graham Ike, Braden Huff, Dusty Stromer, like all those guys were in this system last year and are being evaluated based on how they performed defensively last year. Outside of Dusty Stromer and maybe Braden Huff, I don't know that you see dramatic defensive improvements for anybody on this roster who was there last year. Emmanuel Inocente is a great defensive player, but how many minutes is he going to get that's going to impact Gonzaga's defense? Those are the questions. Those are the concerns. Those are the reality for Gonzaga, is that for them to be a national championship contender, the defense is going to have to be better than what the polls and the analytics sites are projecting. And that's going to require players who were okay to decent to bad defensive players last year being better. It's going to require somebody to step up and be more of a rim protector. Graham Ike's not that. Ben Gregg's not that. Braden Huff, does he become that? Is that what needs to happen? I don't think Ismaila Diani is playing more than a handful of minutes in garbage time, so I don't think he's the answer. He also looks very, very raw because he's 17 years old, and so he's just a little bit raw in that area. But this is an area where I think if Gonzaga doesn't find ways to be much better than these projections defensively, their ceiling is probably not where folks want it to be. And it's something I'm sure Mark Few and the staff are working on figuring out what they can do to put themselves in the best position possible going forward defensively for this team. Looking at Gonzaga's non-conference slate, I'm going to rapid fire all the rankings here for each of the teams Gonzaga's playing in the non-con, and then we'll talk about what it means for the Zags. Baylor's at 11, a little lower than they are in the AP poll. Arizona State is at 71, so them picking up some top 25 votes is a little odd. UMass Lowell comes in at 120. San Diego State is at 48, just inside the top 50. Long Beach State is Gonzaga's worst non-con opponent based on KenPom. They are at 270. West Virginia is at 87. Kentucky's at 42. I'm not surprised that the KenPom system is having a hard time figuring out what to do with a completely new roster like Kentucky's. UConn is at number 5. Nichols is at 186. Bucknell is at 246. And then UCLA just outside the top 25. They come in at number 26. So Gonzaga's playing 5 top 50 KenPom teams. They're playing 8 KenPom top 125 teams, and they're only playing 3 teams in the non-conference that are currently outside the top 150. Again, we don't know who they'll play between Indiana, Louisville, Arizona, or if Providence, Oklahoma, something like that happens. But none of those teams are outside the top 150 unless Davidson makes an incredible run, and at that point, they'd probably be inside the top 150 anyway. The Zags almost always play multiple teams outside the top 250. This year, they're only playing 1, and it's Long Beach State. Yes, Bucknell's 246. They're very close. But in years past, Gonzaga's had 6. I remember a few years ago, maybe it was even last year, they had 6 non-conference opponents outside of the top 229 at KenPom. This year, there's only 2. Bucknell at 246, Long Beach at 270. Teams like Nichols, who's 186th, or UMass Lowell, who's 120th, or even Arizona State, who comes in at 71, are better quality non-conference opponents than Gonzaga traditionally plays. I know people like to laugh at the bye games for Gonzaga and like, oh, like look, they're playing this junior college team or whatever, and it's like that's not the case this year. They're not they didn't buy a bunch of games against schools in the SWAC like Mississippi Valley State or Jackson State. They didn't do that this year. So I'm encouraged and happy to see Gonzaga play a very competitive non-conference schedule that's not just competitive because of the top-tier marquee opponents that they're playing, but is more competitive throughout, top to bottom. I think that's going to help serve this team well going into the conference season. And going into the conference play, here's what we're looking at for the WCC. We'll talk a little bit more about this in the final segment as well. Gonzaga, of course, number 1 in the conference at number 9 overall. Next is St. Mary's. Also not a surprise. They come in at 34th, so them picking up a handful of votes for the top 25 sort of tracks with where KenPom has them at this point. Then you have San Francisco and Santa Clara. Not a surprise. That's pretty much how it has continued to look in the WCC in the post-BYU era. Gonzaga, St. Mary's, San Francisco, Santa Clara. San Francisco is 85th. So there's a 50-spot gap between St. Mary's and San Francisco, 51 actually. Santa Clara then comes in at 95 and fourth in the conference. Then you get your first newcomer, Washington State, at 111. Again, a tough team to pin down with so many newcomers on that roster. LMU is next at 131, followed by the other newcomer, Oregon State, at 144. Then there's a large gap before you get to the bottom four. These are the teams that are really dragging down the WCC. Again, a collection of teams we're used to seeing here at the bottom. Pepperdine is 232nd. Then you have Portland next at 274th. Portland would be the worst team Gonzaga plays in the non-conference schedule per KenPom. 274 for Portland. Next up, Pacific, the Tigers, 287, considering they were in the 350s last year. That's actually a very huge jump for Pacific under new coach Dave Smart, but still not a particularly good ranking for them. And then Steve Lavin's Toreros lost a ton of talent from last year, added nobody in the transfer portal except grad transfer Colby Brooks, who comes over from Gonzaga. San Diego comes in at 295th. So there's some teams really dragging down the WCC, as there always is. But once again, it looks like it's going to be decently competitive at the top with a couple of marquee programs in the middle there in San Francisco and Santa Clara. Maybe marquee is not the right word, but solid mid-major programs that I think have the potential to move up from those rankings. And folks, we know Gonzaga is not joining the Pac-12 until 2026, but we know there's 8 teams in the league. What do they look like coming into this season? It gives us a nice picture of kind of how these programs are probably going to line up by the time Gonzaga and that Pac-12 conference comes together. We're going to talk about that and more coming up here in just a second. Right after I tell you about FanDuel, NFL fans, you can start your season with a huge return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, when you get a hunch in the middle of a game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more, all on the same page where you place your bets. And you get started with $200 in bonus bets. That's guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. And folks, Gonzaga's odds fell. I don't know what did it, what changed, but FanDuel is now at plus 3,000 for Gonzaga to win the national championship. If you haven't thrown $5 down, now is the perfect opportunity to do so, because you get more money if they actually cut down those nets in March, and you get $200 in bonus bets whether you win or lose. So check it out at FanDuel.com, America's #1 sportsbook. All right, folks, closing out the show, continuing our conversation about the KenPom preseason projections, all 361 Division I college basketball programs. We talked about the WCC and how those rankings shake out. But now, to close out the show, let's take a look at what we know about the new Pac-12. Gonzaga's conference starting in 2026. There are 8 teams currently, 8 basketball teams, I should say, currently in the Pac-12. We're going to look at how they're projected for this upcoming season. We're also going to talk about the other teams that have been discussed. This gives us a good opportunity to kind of really compare and look at, okay, this is a team the Pac-12 is talking about, but wow, they're expected to be this good at basketball or this not good at basketball, and kind of evaluate how much of a difference some of these schools that are being discussed would make in terms of Gonzaga's strength of schedule in conference play. Again, knowing that where they're projected heading into the 25-26 season, or excuse me, 24-25 season, is not where they're going to be projected when we get to the actual creation of this conference, but still a good barometer. Right now, if this conference were real heading into this season, here's how the projections would stand out. No surprise, of course, Gonzaga is still #1 at #9 overall in the KenPom rankings. #2 is Boise State at 45, 3 spots ahead of San Diego State, who we discussed earlier, is at 48. So 3 top 50 KenPom teams out of the 8 teams in this conference right now. Next up is Utah State, coming in at number 72, a roster with a lot of turnover as well. After Coach Danny Sprinkle left to go to Washington, they still come in at 72. 4 spots later, Colorado State comes in at 76. Worth pointing out, that puts Gonzaga, Boise State, San Diego State, Utah State, Colorado State all ahead of San Francisco, just in terms of comparing from the current WCC to what the future Pac-12 is going to look like. Then you have, of course, the 2 other Pac-12 schools that are currently in the WCC, Washington State at 111, Oregon State at 144, and then it rounds out with Fresno State. And folks, just to highlight how not good Fresno State is as a men's basketball program, they're at KenPom 273rd. That is 1 spot ahead of Portland. That is 3 spots behind Long Beach State, the worst non-conference game that Gonzaga is playing. If Gonzaga scheduled Fresno State as a non-conference game, it would be their worst opponent. I want to reiterate that point. I'm not saying Fresno State shouldn't be in the league or anything like that. I get why they're here. I understand, but that is not an addition to the new Pac-12 that is helping Gonzaga on the basketball court really in any way. But what are some additions that would? Well, we know that the AAC, the American Athletic Conference, is a strong target for the Pac-12, and Memphis is potentially waffling on their decision to stick it out. If the Pac-12 can find a way, by a way, I mean a big old bag of money, to convince Memphis to leave the American and join the Pac-12, that's a huge addition, and it likely creates a ripple effect that could result in a 4 or even 5 teams joining the Pac-12 from the American. So if Memphis joined, they'd be 43rd in KenPom right now. So that would put them second in the conference, just ahead of Boise State. Wichita State is another basketball-only school that is in the American. I've mentioned them as a potential target. They'd be 101st, so ahead of Washington State, behind Colorado State. South Florida, who would be geographically a bit of a nightmare, but could follow Memphis if the American Conference were to end up losing Memphis. South Florida is 102nd, Tulane 188th, and then UT San Antonio 225th. So UT San Antonio, a popular, oft-discussed team, potentially target for the Pac-12. Just as a reminder, 7 spots ahead of Pepperdine in the preseason projections for this upcoming year. That is not an addition, again, that is going to help Gonzaga very much. That's not going to be why they make the decisions in the Pac-12. But if you're thinking, oh, San Antonio, they can't be that bad. No, it's not a good addition for men's basketball side. Other Mountain West options, New Mexico 62nd, Nevada 73rd, UNLV is 94th. If the Pac-12 does end up going back to the Mountain West and trying to make that work, there's a lot of legality and issues that could come into play if that were the reality, but that's 3 top 100 teams coming into the season, so certainly would be helpful from the men's basketball side of things. And then some other additions. Grand Canyon's 54th. Frankly, that's too low for Grand Canyon. They just played Baylor in a secret scrimmage. I know it's a secret scrimmage. I know they don't count. It was Scott Drew versus Bryce Drew, brothers playing each other in a secret gym. Nobody saw the game. We don't know what happened, but we also know that Grand Canyon only lost by 3. I don't think that that's that surprising. Grand Canyon's got a ton of veteran talent on this roster. They had a big-time player in Jacoby Coles from TCU. Tyon Grant Foster is back and could realistically lead the country in scoring. That Grand Canyon team is going to be good this year and would be a very fun addition on the men's basketball side for Gonzaga in the Pac-12. Outside of that, New Mexico State, 158th. Texas State, they're discussed quite frequently as a member of the Sun Belt. They're at 178th, so not the worst, but also not great. Speaking of the worst, Sacramento State, who's making a huge push to try to get into the Pac-12, who has indicated they would play their home games at the Sacramento Kings Arena if they got into the Pac-12. Hopefully that's going to help them a lot with recruiting because they are projected to finish 300th and the preseason KenPom rankings. And then Denver, who I've heard brought up a few times, very, very bad men's basketball program. They're 315th. Neither Denver or Sac State would be. It's hard to imagine they're at any point ever productive additions to the Pac-12 on the men's basketball side. The dream conference is this: 14 teams, 10 football teams, 4 being basketball-only schools or non-football schools, I should say. Here's how it lines up. If the Pac-12 could pull this off, I would love Gonzaga's conference here. Gonzaga, of course, number 1, 9th overall. St. Mary's 34th. Memphis 43rd. Boise State 45th. San Diego State 48th. That's 5 top 50 teams in this fictional dream Pac-12 scenario. Grand Canyon next at 54. Utah State at 72. Colorado State at 76. So that puts you at what? 6, 7, 8 teams in the top 100, basically 8 teams in the top 75 with Colorado State at 76. Wichita State is 101st. South Florida is 102nd. Washington State 111th. Oregon State 144th. Tulane 188th. And then Fresno State 273rd. That would be an incredible men's basketball conference. I don't know how likely this is. I think it happening exactly this way is very unlikely to happen. But if the Pac-12 can pull off adding those American schools, and they do want to beef up the basketball by adding some non-football programs, perhaps it could look something like this in a best case scenario for the Zags. And I think San Diego State's a little down this year. I think Grand Canyon is a little underrated. I think Oregon State and Washington State are going to be better once they're not in the WCC. So this is a conference that could realistically be one of the 5 best in college basketball. And Gonzaga would be leading the charge. And that's an incredible thought of what the future might look like for Mark Few's program. It's going to wrap it up for me today here on the Locked On Zags podcast. Folks, thank you so much to those of you who have made the show your first listen or your first watch of the day. We'll be back with more player previews as we get ready for the start of the season. We're going to be at WCC Media Day on Thursday. So on Friday, we're going to have some fantastic, super fun content for you all. Myself, Zach Farmer, the host of the unofficial WCC Hoops podcast, going to be going live, talking to coaches, players in the WCC on Thursday. So do not miss that at all. All right, folks, that's going to wrap it up again. Thank you for listening. And until next time, as always, go Zags.